Hi, everyone, and welcome to The X, a podcast from inside Silicon Valley about how experience shapes everything, from products to businesses to entire industries. I'm Brian McLean, and I'm here with Demetrius Madrigal.
In 2022 and the first half of 2023, and that number is climbing.
Google today joined a growing list of tech giants scaling back, adding to the tens of thousands of workers in the industry who find themselves unemployed.
It is Amazon doing another round of layoffs.
Mark Zuckerberg's year of efficiency back in focus this morning after another round of sweeping layoffs and job cuts.
The email that was sent out in the morning to everyone at the company basically saying, unfortunately, your role was impacted. And then that's how I found out. And then they pretty much shut everything off at the end of the day.
I was on the committee that was hiring new college grads. It was like thousands and thousands of applications for maybe like 10 or 15 spots. But I thought, if we're still hiring new college grads, clearly the company is fine. Why would we hire, new grads if the company were going to do layoffs?
All right, everyone. So, as you could tell from that clip, we are going to be talking about tech layoffs today. In particular, we're going to talk about user experience, the area that we work in. That includes research and design and all things UX, because this is one of those hot topics that has been circling around LinkedIn, in the news, kind of all over the place. And so we thought it was a good time for us to jump in and give our perspective on what's going on. Good morning, Dee. How are you?
I'm doing pretty good. There's a lot of this news going around, so I think it's important for us to dig into it and kind of give our perspective on it.
So this podcast is not much different from our other podcasts, except we're exploring our own industry today, and we're going to kind of get into that. There's been quite a few articles written about the death of UX. Why are layoffs happening in user experience? Is AI taking over our jobs? And we want to give our perspective, having worked in this industry for over 20 years, starting with NASA and then about 18 years with our consultancy company, Metric Lab. We don't work internally at these companies. We do sometimes for short stints and periods when we're kind of supporting a bigger project. But we have the kind of touch points of many, many companies, many conversations with lots of different people at different companies around the Valley. And so we wanted to kind of explain what we're seeing and also talk a little bit about the reports. Excuse me. So reports of layoffs and declining in hiring in this space. So Indeed reported earlier in the year that since their peak in early 2022, UX research job listings, that's kind of more specifically what Dee and I do, have dropped 71%, and UX design job listings have dipped about 70%. Tech roles beyond UX, like software engineering and product management, have very similar pullback in open roles. This is also something that we are seeing anecdotally as well. Many of our colleagues have either posted or texted us about losing their jobs and looking for new projects to work on, and especially being at companies that they've kind of resided at for 4 to 5 years. So let's talk about this, Dee. So what are your initial thoughts? What are you hearing? What are you seeing? Let's dive in.
Well, I think it's important to take note that overall, even though it doesn't necessarily feel like it, the economy from a metric perspective is doing really well. So this is, we've had 5 straight quarters of economic growth. We're almost 5% increase in the third quarter of last year. We had record spending, consumer spending during the holidays. We have very low unemployment, like something around 3.7%, and increased labor force participation. So it's not just because people have left the labor force. We have inflation lowering. We have gas prices lowering. We have more money going towards the poorer people within the country. This is not ultimately because of an economic tank. I look at it and I think to myself, all right, we had, while the rest of the country was struggling during the pandemic economically, we had an influx of spending. We had more people spending money on Netflix and Amazon and Apple and all these other different kind of software, hardware products, especially focused on the home. And now that pendulum has swung back. And we've said this before, it feels as though like everything is shrinking when it comes to tech, but at the same time, if you look at like the number of uh, researchers, designers, engineers, for the most part, we're approaching the levels that we were at pre-pandemic. We're actually still above where those are. Same thing with company stock price and revenue, everything else. We're still kind of above pre-pandemic rates. So ultimately, we're still. It's because of the contrast of the boom during the pandemic years that I think this is feeling the way it is and kind of performing the way it is.
Mhm.
It also, to me, just anecdotally, I get the sense that tech companies right now, are not really focused on growth. They're when you think about researchers and UX in particular, the reason why you have people doing research is because you're planning for future growth. They're not as important or not as useful for maintaining kind of where you are currently within the market, because for the most part you're getting data from a variety of sources. You're not looking forward as much. You're not as much looking for the deeper insights. You're just kind of, treading water. You don't really need something like that.
Yeah.
You kind of feel the same way?
Yeah, yeah. When you were saying like, we kind of increased during the pandemic, I want to give some perspective there. So, a couple articles I read, also talked to a few friends had worked in the industry and said that in some cases they had 15, maybe 20, 25 UX researchers in particular at their company. And then they ended up with about 80 after the pandemic subsided, or lockdowns, or whatever you want to call it. Dee's right about what that indicator actually means. So Dee and I have been through a bunch of these ups and downs, and I call them the innovation ups and downs, because research is continuous and happening all the time. And some people break it into like three categories. You have like your type of research that's done where you're just like usability testing and making sure your interface looks good and it's functioning and people get it, and if the fewest clicks possible and that kind of stuff. That's great. That's done every day. And that has to happen. It's necessary. Then you have kind of the research that's in the middle, which is kind of like, hey, well, what do customers really want? Can we come up with new ideas? Can we pilot prototypes and bring them to market? Thinking about innovation, about the future. And then you kind of have this other stuff, which is a lot of what Dee and I do, in addition to the usability testing, which is we do a strategic research where we're actually trying to help solve big problems for executives. So when those executives are like, hey, we can't figure out why this particular thing is happening within our user base, we will kind of conduct research to hunt down and figure that out. That middle section there is, it's where researchers thrive. I mean, it's the fun area of like, hey, what would happen if we introduced a hoverboard to the world? It's like these crazy ideas that sometimes lead into big things, but it's expensive. It's expensive. I mean, you could read many articles, and Dee, I think, has even talked about this in previous episodes, that, Google X, their kind of innovation lab or whatever, has really scaled down over the years because they're pumping so much money into it, but they're not getting a lot of the rewards because the rewards are so long term. And Dee and I have worked with all of those different groups that really kind of look at the innovation sector and had some of the best times of our lives and so much fun. But we would always look at each other and go, wow, this is really expensive to do because there's not a lot of reward coming from it.
Yeah.
So I understand the perspective of scaling down that particular area, particularly right now. Like the fact that you pinpointed, Dee, like, hey, I don't think they want to grow. People be like, wait a minute, you're talking about tech always wants to grow. Yeah, they want to grow and they grow, but sometimes you just focus on the things that are going really well with your company and growing those instead of growing brand new ideas. Sometimes you
Yeah,
take a
and
little break from it.
there's some other factors at play also. So number one, I don't know if you saw this, but a while back when inflation was really high and unemployment was super low, we reached a point where there were more job openings in the country than there were job seekers, right? So
Yeah.
we could have gotten to zero unemployment and effectively a negative unemployment. And Jerome Powell, I believe he's the head of the Fed,
Yes.
put out a statement that basically said, "Hey, slow down on hiring, otherwise you're going to end up with a permanent increase in wages that are just going to be going to." Yeah, he's the head of the Federal Reserve. If we don't slow down on hiring, then what was going to happen is it's going to cause a permanent increase in wages, because once the wages go up, it's really hard to bring them back down again, almost impossible. So he sent out an open letter to pretty much every industry in the country, saying, "Hey, if you don't slow down on hiring, if you can't find a way to work at a lower level of hiring, then you're going to have a permanent increase in your costs because you're going to have to pay more because of the competitive nature of the labor market.
Yeah.
So in response, that's right after that is when we started seeing a bunch of the layoffs. And I think in response, people said, "Hey, we are currently in a seller's market when it comes to labor, and we prefer to make our investments in a buyer's market because we're the buyers."
Yeah.
So I kind of think they're riding out this low employment wage increase time period and looking to make their investments when things turn around, which means they're waiting for a recession to happen so that they can take advantage of it, which is, yeah, I haven't heard anybody say this, but it certainly kind of feels that way with the way things are going.
Absolutely. I have heard from quite a few people who work in recruiting, and they were saying that definitely they've kind of slowed down the amount of job openings and things like that. But there's also some companies that are like, great, you can all slow down, and then we're gonna rev up
Yeah.
as a way of grabbing competition, which you see in tech all the time. Tech has learned this lesson a little bit, and so I think they're also trying to be more strategic, like doing hiring freezes. So instead of saying like, oh, we're going to lay off a ton of people or even a small group of people, you say like, we're just going to freeze for a while and let everything stabilize. Um, the other thing I wanted to bring up is something that I don't have a strong data on, but you and I have seen it so many times that I'm starting to feel like it's becoming a real thing. And that's like what happens during a presidential election year. So
Yeah.
the run up to the election year with the stock market is a great example. Is it kind of has some sort of chaos, and the reason why it has chaos is because the market itself. They always say the market itself likes stability. It likes to know what's going on. It likes to have a few things that it can predict. Well, I find that tech is kind of the same way. Companies tend to be a little bit cautious on that year because they just don't know what's going to happen, right? Especially with a polarizing election like we have right now. There's a very big difference between business policy and basically like what investments will be made into the infrastructure of technology and all that kind of stuff with a Donald Trump president versus a Joe Biden president. So
Yeah.
if you don't know what's going to happen, then you just kind of hang loose and you just kind of keep
Yeah.
doing what you're doing and you don't make any huge big bets. And then once you know what's happening and you feel like you understand the next 2 or 3 years, then you make huge bets and you start hiring again and ramping up. And there's like a cyclical thing that happens. And I've seen it multiple times. And so I came into this year telling people like, just realize that things are going to kind of be a little rocky until we figure out who's going to win this election.
Yeah, and I think it makes a lot of sense. Because one of the things that decision makers in any company, whether it's a major investor or a board member or an executive, they kind of abhor uncertainty. They want to have kind of a clear picture of what the future is going to be in order to make their decisions. And the biggest thing around that is kind of the environment, the political environment, when it comes to regulation, when it comes to government investments, all of those kinds of things. You wouldn't necessarily want to spend a bunch of money in an area like if you were, getting into space and satellites, and let's say you were setting up to be either, you are uh, a company that's already doing a lot of space and satellite launches and those kinds of things, and you don't necessarily want to invest heavily in that in order for the new administration to come in and decide that that's not a priority for them. So you don't know if you're going to see, a Republican administration come in and make wholesale changes to Section 230 or to regulation or all these things that are going to affect your choices that you're making. So there's a lot of wait and sees during this kind of thing, this kind of situation. And I think with these two, the way that the political parties are so aligned in very opposite ways right now kind of aggravates that, because in previous cases you could say like, all right, well, if it's Republican or Democrat, we're pretty sure that these kinds of things will stay the same because we feel like that everybody's kind of agreed that this is going to stay.
Mm-hmm.
But that doesn't seem to be the case now. I don't think anybody's taking anything for granted if there is a Republican administration as far as what will stay the same.
Absolutely. Yeah. Yeah. No, you're totally spot on with that. So it's something that I think our listeners need to just keep in mind. And just consider, especially as you're kind of job hunting, or if you've been laid off, we deeply empathize with that. It's a really stressful time, and we're not trying to say that this justifies it by having, reasons why, but sometimes it does provide a little bit of comfort because you kind of know that you're not in it alone, and that everyone's kind of dealing with this, but it's also a cycle, and the cycle will end and it'll go the other direction like it normally does.
It always has before. One thing I'll point out also, though, is that most of the people that we've known that have gotten laid off, up until very recently, because it's been so recent, we haven't been able to see the outcome yet. But almost everybody we've seen get laid off has found another job fairly quickly. Like there are other places that are hiring, and there are places that haven't done layoffs, and it's for the reason that you mentioned before, that they tend to not work out financially in the long term for the company. So companies like Apple and Nvidia, as far as I know, they haven't had any layoffs, and that's because they're doing very well financially, and it's also because they recognize that layoffs are not in their best interest.
Absolutely, yeah. And I want to circle back and talk about something. So you had mentioned that there's pretty much a consistent amount of layoffs across, UX, engineering, things like that. But I think you mentioned that we did see or maybe mentioned to me before the podcast, that we did see a little bit more in the design area, and like UX design. And I want to talk about this like interesting kind of thing that's actually happening, not at every company, but at some companies. And basically, what it is that when a designer, applies for a job, their expectation for it is not for you to just be a designer, but to also have some research skills and to have prototyping skills and kind of like being able to do it all. Um, and it's an interesting thing because someone coming in and conducting a little bit of their own research and kind of just being able to, do a little usability testing or something like that, that's definitely helpful, and just have a little bit of experience. But we've definitely talked to some companies where they were like trying this experiment of like combining a researcher and a designer, and they're two different mindsets. That's the hard part about it, is that a designer is a very like creative person who's like really thinking about like what could be and that kind of stuff, and researchers are trying to answer big why questions. Why is this happening? What's going on? I want to tell a story. And they don't always work well together. I was wondering what your thoughts are on it, D. This experiment has actually been pushed multiple times. I saw it back in 2014, 15, actually. I'd written it down. That's the only reason why I remember, is that they
Yep.
were doing the same thing. They were kind of trying to hire these like quasi like design researchers. How do you feel about
Well,
that?
I think it's important to keep in mind why this has happened when it comes to designers. So I feel like for designers, because it is such a subjective role, right? You can't really evaluate it in the same way you would with an engineer, of like how many lines of code did you do, how many bugs have you squashed, like all of those things. You have like actual metrics as far as how good they are. With the designer, whether you're a visual designer or an interaction designer, you can have some kind of usability metrics. Maybe you can have some hedonic metrics around it, but at the end of the day, those are subjective, right? So it comes down to, how do you differentiate between who's a really good designer and who isn't? And when it came down to competing for jobs, one of the ways in which designers have made themselves more attractive for jobs are the capabilities you mentioned. Like, oh, you can hire me because I can do some usability testing on these products also, or I can build I have enough front end coding knowledge to build out a prototype. Those kinds of things. So that's kind of why I think that's happened. And I think that's ultimately a good thing. Number one, they're better consumers of the data. They can make better decisions around kind of the design of a product. There are ultimately some limitations on what kind of research a designer should be doing. Um, for example, they probably should not be testing their own designs very much because they're too biased.
Yeah.
What we would advise people to do is like, all right, well, pair them up with another designer with similar testing experience, or with a researcher, and have them trade off. So they're not testing their own product; they're testing like a kind of a buddy system thing. Then they should also probably be doing larger scale strategic stuff, and more kind of tactical things like some usability. Especially, we always say the first round of usability is really important, because you want to iron out the big kinks, make sure that your interaction model is working well, make sure that your information architecture is very intuitive, all of those kinds of things. And that's what you get from that first usability evaluation. And then after that, you can shift to much lighter weight stuff. You can shift to kind of unmoderated things. And then it's more about like moving buttons and changing colors. Uh, that I think is where you can really leverage the designers as researchers. But I'll tell you, I feel as though, and you can say if you feel like this is true too, roughly half the work that we have is people coming to us and saying, "Hey, we have this data set that we've gathered, and we can't figure out what it means. Can you take a look at it and help us interpret this data?" And I think that's an area where a researcher will be able to do this, who has a lot of experience and has seen a lot of data, and has been ideally working in a few different environments, where someone who isn't specialized in that might have a harder time.
Yeah, that has been more recently a kind of a popular request from us, but I think it's because it's strategic. So it's kind of like, hey, we have all this call center data that indicates this thing is going on, and then we have another set of data from customer success managers that are saying this thing or whatever. How do we compile it all, tell a story about what's going on, and figure out how to make things better for the customer? That is the case. I would say though that, like, I'm going to give a great example. When we were helping out GoPro quite a while back, actually, it was like 2014, maybe at the time. I met a designer that was there who was really, really good at doing basically like 3D models of his designs. And one of the cool things that happened is he had taken his designs. I think he'd worked at another big company and kind of took some of their education and training in this area. And I thought it was pretty smart was he came up with this design and then he created a 3D model of it so it can move around and all that kind of stuff. And it just kind of felt like you were actually using the camera, but it was just on your screen. And I remember him showing me this and I thought, wow, this is the kind of the future. Because prior to that, almost all the designers came in and would just give like static drawings or they would hand sketch something. And in this case, it felt very real.
Yeah.
So when you say like, having some of these prototyping skills is important, I like totally agree with that. Like even myself, I try to do some extra stuff here and there just to kind of like feel like I can make things when I need to.
Mhm.
But from the research side of things, it's like the storytelling around your particular idea does need to be done by somebody who's not owning the idea. Because when you own the idea, you just feel compelled to massage how customers feel by the way in which you communicate
Yeah.
or look at the data even from a different angle, right? And so companies, they know this, tech companies know this. And so that's why they have researchers on staff and they keep them on staff. And I think if you're a researcher, for example, that was recently laid off and you're thinking about what type of research you want to do, you should really think about like where you actually thrive and the area you like the most. Because most companies that we work with, researchers get kind of pigeonholed into doing one thing, whether it be ethnography, meaning being out in the field and connecting with customers, qualitatively, or like being in house and just doing a ton of testing on UI products and things like that, or working with management and strategically figuring out when you put all the pieces together what is really happening with our customer. And so I like the fact that there's a lot of opportunities in a lot of places out there. And sometimes, when hard things happen and we either lose clients or our friends lose their jobs or whatever, they take a moment to actually think about that stuff that you said, about like, well, what's actually happening right now? Well, people come with us to big data sets. They want to tell stories. Do you want to tell stories that way or do you want to tell them a different way? And once you figure that out, the next job could be amazing and so much better. So
Yeah.
it's good that you called that out. I also wanted to call out something else too. Recently, Jeff Bezos did a interview on Lex Friedman's podcast. Probably a lot of people saw it. It was a really good interview, actually. I mean, Jeff Be- Jeff Bezos is fantastic when it comes to customer connection. Like he really, 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 really cares about it. He knows that the central core of his company is customer connection, and he talks about qualitative research and how important it is, and how really, really important it is to listen to your customer. And it's one of the reasons why Amazon does really well. Tech companies know this, but at the same time, sometimes it feels like the easiest thing to cut. For real. Like if you're just
Yeah.
sitting here looking at the papers and you're like, should we cut engineering or should we cut research down to a skeleton crew? It just feels easy to say, let's cut research down to a skeleton crew, but that could really bite you in the butt 3 years later when your customer satisfaction scores go down.
Yeah, I feel as though there's a couple things at play here. Number one is they feel like, okay, if we start to slip, we can always reinvest and bring them back. I think they feel as though, and they're probably right, that is easier to hire researchers than it is to hire engineers,
Yeah,
especially,
probably. Hmm.
and probably good designers also. Um, and that I think is ultimately because it's just hard to hire those people. Very hard to hire those people. Um, it's very hard to differentiate who is a good designer and who's not a good designer, and it's
Hmm.
also hard to find to differentiate who's a good engineer and who's not a good engineer. But I feel like there's a little bit more available in the engineering space in order to evaluate
Well,
for
let me call
researchers.
you out on something there real quick. Is that like part of that is the fact that our field is still kind of new, right?
It is,
To some extent, right? Like people think of it as being around forever, but like when we first started, 18 years ago, which is not that long ago, there wasn't that many researchers out there, and it was only
yeah,
called human factors research, and it was mostly in hardware. And only like innovative companies like
yeah.
eBay and Microsoft were really pushing the limits and bringing in a lot of research components that were new and interesting. So to some extent, it's just still kind of new. We're still kind of figuring out what it looks like.
Yeah, there's another thing I think that is kind of inherent to kind of research as a field that kind of works against us when it comes to staffing, and that is if you have a few good generalist senior researchers, you can get away with a lot. You can have them focus on the very important stuff, and the less important stuff can kind of either sell. You can have like a lot of the usability being done by designers so that it's not as important. As long as you have somebody who's doing like the major strategic direction things, and every now and then if you're looking to invest in a new product with a new value proposition, you can have them do that too. You can skate pretty well on just a small handful of researchers. It's just when you are getting to the point where you're trying to get to that next level of growth, that's when you kind of need to ramp up. But
Mhm.
it's the unfortunate truth that like if you have the right researchers, you can probably do 80 to 90% of the most important stuff that you need for your company with that skeleton crew.
Yeah, it's very true. It's very true. And I read an interesting article that said that during the hiring phase during the pandemic, a lot of the researchers that came in had PhDs, which is not necessary
Hmm.
at all. Most of the researchers we know either have a bachelor's or master's and been kind of training in the industry.
Yeah,
Not even masters as much too sometimes. But the PhDs that kind of came in at senior level and had never worked in tech before. So there's a
yeah,
lot of them
that's
coming out of university and just kind of going like, okay, so how do you guys do this? And then kind of figuring it out. And I think that they probably struggle a little bit as well. I mean, they can adapt quite quickly because it's like research is research and you can kind of figure it out. But
yeah,
there also is a very, very business oriented need that comes from a good researcher. Researchers need to look at money and they need to
yeah.
look at the business and they need to look at scalability. And I think when you're traditionally trained to the university, you don't always think about those things because you're not in business. And so when you come in, you have to put that in the front of your mind when you, especially work with leadership, your job is to help this business grow. So what does that look like
Yeah.
when you're conducting your research and how much you're spending and all that kind of stuff? You know what I mean?
So I think that I would say that I would caution people when it comes to hiring PhDs straight out of a university who have strictly academic um, experience because it's a different skill set. There's different goals in mind. There's different tools that you're leaning on. You're probably going to be much less concerned with statistical significance. You're
Hmm.
not setting up for publication and peer review because everything you're doing needs to be confidential. So uh, when you're in the academic side, everything is about getting things public and getting the information out there and submitting it for peer review. And you don't really do that in within a company because you need to move too quickly for that.
Yeah.
And you need to be more confidential. And even when it comes to internal peer review, there's plenty of companies like when we were working with Google, for example, where they made sure to let us know to not communicate with anyone outside of this core team about about whatever was that we're working on. They should not even be aware that it exists.
Hmm. Yeah.
So you can't even do peer review within your own company because there's the cross departmental confidentiality. So that it's a very you're looking at different metrics, you're using different methodologies, you're working at a different set of assumptions, you're working in a different schedule. Like this is no longer like you get your in academics, you get your grants, you do your research. A couple of years later, you publish it, and that's basically your product. And there's a completely different set. And we saw this when we worked with NASA on a external stint, coming in as external researchers to help them out because they were working on something where they were expected to get to provide deliverables outside of just research findings, and it was a new world for them.
No, absolutely, yeah. And when you say caution, it doesn't mean you don't hire them because they're a lot of them are whip smart. It's the idea that they probably need about, I would say, like 6 months of mentorship on like process and kind of like
Yeah.
trimming out a lot of the thinking that you do in the university. I mean, even for some of our first projects when we first started, we're kind of selling our company Metric Lab, and we're like, hey, we want to come in and help you out. We came in with some serious rigor. And then
Yeah.
once we started working with the team, they were like, okay, come on, let's get this done. You got till tomorrow. And I was like, tomorrow. And I
Hmm.
realized what was happening. It was like you gain quick insights, you apply the insights. You gain the insights, you apply the insights. And it was like we need to keep moving and kind of see how it goes.
Yeah.
We can't sit around and doing this. And because if you sit around and you take too long to conduct research, basically, as time passes, things change and then it's no longer valid.
Hmm.
And then you look back 3 years later and you realize your researchers haven't provided a lot to the company, right? So that's all been
Yeah.
adjusted over the last 15 years. And now we have clear deliverables. Same thing with internal researchers, right? Like clear deliverables, things that need to be
Hmm.
achieved by a certain period of time before launch and that kind of stuff. And you're on the same timetables. You're just conducting research in a different way. And it's effective, super effective. It's just not super long-term research.
Yeah. It's what I would say as far as caution is that make sure that a person who's coming in is not expecting to work in the same way that they would with an academic research lab because they're very, very different. And just as an example, I would say that when we got started, and this was the very, very infancy of kind of UX research within the industry, and there were no real guidelines or anything that had been established yet. But it took me, I would say, about a year and a half to realize that I cannot write up these reports of the research that are being done in the same way I would write up an article for peer review. Like as far as the structure, the detail, all of the different things. Where the focus within a research article is going to be your methodology. How did you do this? What was your apparatus? What were all those things? When you come into kind of the tech space, the focus is on the results
Mm-hmm.
and what were the findings and what can we say confidently and what can we act on. That is not the focus within academics.
Yeah. I
Academics
will
is very process oriented.
I will point out, like, and I know this is off topic a little bit, and then we'll kind of jump back to the topic, but is that when we figured out how to summarize basically the whole like apparatus, what we did, why we did it, all into one page, and we did it almost more visually, and then we were
Hmm.
able to stand in front of the teams and say, here's what the research was, here's what we did, here's how it happened, here's the pluses and minuses, and now let's talk about the results. It like
Yeah.
streamlined everything for us. But you're right. It took us time to like unlearn a very rigorous process. But I want to talk a little bit. I want to switch over to this kind of final chapter or section of our industry that is kind of taking some interesting like hits. Is that there's been reports and some Medium articles and things like that are written that there's this impending doom for our industry. And part of it is around artificial intelligence, that AI
Hmm.
will be able to just conduct the usability tests automatically for you. It will be able to, look at all the data and tell you stories. And, you can ask AI basically like, imagine that I'm a 34-year-old female looking to buy clothes and I want to get a discount online. Tell me what her behavior is. Or do you feel like that is happening? Like that worry is real? Or are we looking at just a whole new Whole new segment here opening up, and it's just going to be a plethora of opportunities and work for researchers to figure it out.
So the nature of AI is that in order to really make it effective with a certain area, it needs to be trained. It needs to be trained very exhaustively, and the training is unique to the single application that you're going to. So if you have a chatbot like a ChatGPT chatbot that's good for providing good search results or summaries of academic articles or something like that, that means that it's not trained in how to recognize your research needs, translate those into research questions, translate that into methodologies, and then translate that into data acquisition. The way I see that like with everything else, AI will eventually replicate everything that a human mind can do. But I look at that and I'm like, all right, that's decades away. Having that level of understanding and understanding and insight into not just the research process, but also the human process behind it. But and that's assuming that things accelerate, because I think that they will. These are things that humans, fully fledged, fully functioning, very intelligent humans struggle with because it's difficult, and AI is going to struggle with it also. So, but at the same time, AI will play a role. I think it's going to be like when SurveyMonkey started up or when UserZoom started up. There are going to be more tools so that you can free up the time that you're spending as a researcher in doing less old school by hand calculations of the quant data that you're getting, and more looking at uh, the overall trends of the data, the results, understanding them. It'll free up more research methodologies. I remember when we were working at NASA and we were designing a study, and the person who was the lead on that project and said, like, well, this is really powerful, but are we going to have the statistical tools in order to make sense of it all? And he pointed to our other coworker and said, oh yeah, we've got so and so. She's a computational psychologist. She can handle anything we throw at her. I'm like, oh great. And that just opened up what we could do from a methodology standpoint. And that is one of the roles that I think from an AI standpoint, I think it's going to be a tool. It's going to be a bit freeing, especially for some of the more senior people. I think the downside is that if we're not careful, it can hurt the newer people coming in who are doing that kind of legwork and grunt work as a way of learning. And it could kind of hurt them learning fundamentals, having less opportunity coming into the industry, and kind of getting that full perspective of everything that's going on.
Yeah, it's interesting. That's my biggest concern too, is like not getting the ground level experience that's necessary to kind of think through problems. If you come in as a junior researcher and they say, okay, can you run this usability test? You go, great, I'll run it. You run the usability test, you learn about customers, you learn how they think, you learn about words that they use, you learn about all this kind of stuff. If the junior person comes in and their only job is to tell AI, take the results of this particular study and summarize it and put it all together for me, or AI, look at all the video that came in from these 6 different researchers and tell me what they want. Two things are occurring. One is you don't really learn about human interaction and what people say and nuance to their words and things like that, which are super important in research. Like, forget all the data analysis. Look at the nuance of how people communicate. A lot of times they're not telling you the truth, and they're not doing it to be deceptive. They're just doing it because they don't feel comfortable like completely opening up. And so you have to learn how to like get that out of them. And second is that basically your skill set is learning how to write AI code. Basically learn how to write scripts that will convince the AI to do what you want it to do. But then does anyone ever go in and check the data? Does anyone ever go in and say, okay, well, you just summarize these 6 participants who wrote notes about their product use, and it says X, Y, and Z. Do we just take it and run with it, D? Or do we say, oh no, we got to go back and double check and make sure that what they said is actually what they meant? Yeah. And young researchers learn this, and then they grow, and then they get really good at what they do over time. They have a sixth sense almost of it. So I get a little concerned about that. Maybe it's just me being not seeing the future clearly, or there is a truth behind the fact that people do need fundamental training before they can actually master certain tasks that are necessary for business growth.
Yeah, I think there's room within the industry for people who are, more technicians than full specialists.
Yeah.
This kind of takes us back to what we were talking about earlier about the designers who can do some testing. There's absolutely a role for that. There's people who don't need to be senior within their research skills forever, um, but and they can be the ones who don't necessarily need to develop the fundamental skills. But for somebody who is going to specialize on this, is going to make it their calling card, and the industry needs those people because for the bigger questions, you need to make sure that you're coming to the right and appropriate conclusions. Because the only thing worse than no data is bad data. It's the only because they lead to confidently incorrect decisions, and
Mm-hmm.
those are the ones that lose you a lot of money. Uh, for that, you want somebody who's steeped in the fundamentals, understands the basics, and when things become confusing or where somebody might get stuck, they can unravel the knot and see what's happening.
Yeah.
I think that one thing that does happen is sometimes when people call us in to look at data that they don't understand or it's not making sense to them, we can look. So when I get called in for that, a lot of times I will ask for, all right, send me the survey you sent out. I want to see the questions in the order in which they're presented and the options that are provided to people. And also send me I'll take a look at their kind of summary data, but I'll also tell them send me the raw data, the CSV, and I'll dump it into Excel and I'll pick it apart and I'll look for things that are either discrepancies or things that might illuminate a discrepancy. And sometimes a discrepancy could happen because you you missed an option in putting in your survey, and you should have had one other thing that would have cleared it up. Sometimes it's ultimately because you're making an assumption about the population that isn't true.
Mm-hmm.
And one example we had is we were working on somebody with a social platform. I won't name it in order to kind of keep their confidentiality. And they had instituted something that was intended to reduce, like a technology that was intended to reduce the amount of like toxicity on the platform. And technology was active, and they had data about like here's how much it was it was working and how much it was taking action to reduce. But the subjective user reporting was that the toxicity on the platform was more prevalent. They were seeing more of it, and so the company thought, okay, is this just not working? And we took a look at it, and we took a look at all the data, and we realized that certain things were not necessarily conflicting with each other. The ultimate reality was that the users on the platform were becoming more toxic. It wasn't
Mm-hmm.
that the tool wasn't doing its job. So that was one of the assumptions that ended up being being defeated in that situation.
Yeah. And you see that a lot. And I would say that in general, like researchers need a seat at the table. And the reason why I say that is because it's kind of like being the person that knows everything and then no one comes and talks to you to ask what's going on. It's researchers are seeing
Yeah,
everything underneath the hood. And so if you really want to know what's actually happening with your customers, sit down with a researcher and just ask them generally. Don't look at a study or anything. Just say what's going on with our customers. What's happening? What are you feeling? What are you seeing? And that is the beauty of it. And that's something that I see that companies do not utilize that well. Like I feel like they love the reports, they love delivering them to product managers. If that's great, everyone kind of gets their readouts, but rarely does an executive sit down and just say, "Hey, how's everyone doing? How are customers doing? Are they okay? Like, what's your gut
yeah,
feeling tell you based on like the 20 research studies you guys conducted this year, and that kind of stuff." And I know you get a rundown from senior leadership, especially the VP of research does that with C-level executives. But I don't feel like it happens enough. Like, and I'm not in those companies, but I do talk with people that are in them, and they say like, "Yeah, we do a rundown every once in a while." I feel like they need to be like connected at the hip with
hmm
C-level executives, and because it helps kind of smooth out the understanding of like where this company could go and how great it could be if we really give the customer exactly what it wants, which is what Jeff Bezos does. I mean, this guy's got his hands in, or used to have his hands
yeah.
in, customer emails. But I want to get your, as we wrap up here, I want to get your like, where do you think this industry is going? Like, do you think UX research and UX design and everything is going to thrive and do well and over this next phase of technology with artificial intelligence really taking off? Or do you feel like it's
Yes.
something that's going to get left behind?
Yeah, I think it's I think it's going to thrive. I think it's going to continue to grow. I think that we're kind of hitting a little bit of a lull, but we still have more researchers employed within tech companies than we had pre-pandemic. That has increased by a fair amount. The reality is, when it comes to AI and some of these new technologies, that you need data and you need to understand that data in order to train the AI more than you ever did before. It's actually more useful now than it ever has been.
Mm-hmm.
So no longer are you just using data in order to figure out how to include your feature, what features to include in your feature set, or how to design your UI or your information architecture, those things. You are now need that data in order to enable the AI itself. You need that data in order to train the AI. Like,
Yeah.
how does it react? How do we model the human mind in order to do this? How do we get it to respond appropriately to human queries and understand what they mean when they say certain things? So I think that's going to become more important. I'm going to go a little bit further and say that I think that the executives, or in general, the people who are making the big strategic decisions, should have some level of fluency when it comes to research. At a minimum, have a strong ability to comprehend the data that's coming out of it. Because I think the people who are making the decisions, that is the most important part of their job.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that understanding and making the best decisions they can make is essential to success. In order to do that, they don't need to come from research, but I think that it's important to spend some time really understanding how to interpret data. That means spending time with some senior researchers and understanding how they think about data, how they're coming to the conclusions they're making. And I think it wouldn't hurt for them to participate in some way, even just as an observer. If not, it would be great to get each executive, like, once a year, runs a couple interviews and have them directly having the conversations with the users and understanding them. Because so often I see a platform that's designed for 18-year-old women who are being run by all the decision makers are 40 and 50-year-old men
Mm-hmm.
or
Yeah.
older. So they're disconnected from their user base, and they don't understand why the decisions are making uh, aren't being received in the ways that they expect them to. But if they
Absolutely.
spend some time with them and they get to know them, they're
Yeah.
going to make better decisions.
I agree with you. Excuse me. I agree with you. So one of the things that I've noticed is that AI in general right now is in desperate need of research and design.
Yeah.
It's some of the UX is terrible, and it feels like it's the
Hmm.
beginning of the computer era of like 1996 all over again. Um,
Yeah.
and so I'm super optimistic about the industry. I feel like
Hmm.
there's going to be a huge opportunity for researchers and designers to kind of grow into this new space and participate in it and that kind of stuff. I think the only area of caution I would say is that if you're a researcher and you're getting into this industry, get into something that has growth potential, whether it be e-commerce or whatever, but it excites you, and then really become like an expert in understanding that segment. Because I feel like as a researcher, like, you're kind of invaluable if you're the master of the domain. Like, more about the customer, more about the product and how it functions and how to smooth that out and everything than
Hmm.
anybody else, right? And so if you pick a category, an industry that is like really thriving, you'll do great, and things will be great. And don't worry about these layoffs right now. I feel like these layoffs are just like a leveling, like we were talking about, and eventually everything will stabilize and opportunities will be had. So
Yeah.
with that said, I mean, do you have any final notes, D, or should we wrap this thing up?
Well, I agree with you. There's going to be a point in which the companies are going to be ready to aggressively grow, and I think with AI, we're so early on that most of it isn't even being productized yet. We're seeing very small bits and pieces here and there. I don't consider ChatGPT a fully fledged product yet,
No,
but
not
it will
yet.
get
No.
there.
Mm-mm.
Yeah, and once we kind of reach that hill, you're going to start seeing kind of product flow in an entirely different way. I have to point out, just I saw this the other day and I was like, okay, we're at peak hype right now. Their Callaway Golf Clubs released their new line of clubs for the year.
Uh-huh.
The club is named the the Paradigm AI Smoke.
Oh my God.
They put the phrase AI in the name for the club, and almost implying that it's got an AI neural network chip inside the club head telling you what to do.
Does it?
What they mean is that what they mean is that they used the AI to design the club face.
Okay.
That's pretty much all that it means. So, but now it's become full marketing term. So it's super hyped, and that's going to die down. The hype, I think, is actually going to hurt AI in the long run. I saw some things that were like some people very angry at AI in general, as though it's kind of some like single monolithic creature that's dictating everything that's going on. But I would say also that if you're getting into the industry, stay focused on some specific skill set that you want to develop, and it more than kind of a product category. I think it might be more valuable to focus on a type of user.
Yeah.
Because once you understand, like we mentioned before, women, let's say under the age of 25, if you understand the things that they're very interested in, then that is every product and every category within that area. So,
Absolutely.
or men over 40 or something like that, because no matter what product you're going to and working on, those are the users that are going to be using it, and they're going to have the same needs. They're going to have the same worries. They're going to have the same limitations and concerns. It's just applied to a different product. So I think getting really steeped in a certain kind of a market segment and fully understanding that and being very strong at it gives you a lot of flexibility while also maintaining kind of that deep knowledge that you would be looking for.
Well said. Well, with that, I think it's time for a wrap. So thanks everyone so much for taking the time to listen to us today. Really appreciate it. We post all of our updates as well as video versions of the podcast on YouTube at TheXPodcast. So please go to YouTube and subscribe to our channel. If you like this podcast and found it interesting or informative, we would really love it if you left a review or told a friend about it. All right, everyone. Have a great week. We'll see you next week.